Hey, this is Dr. Kingston, and we're going to talk about the nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses. Our objectives here are to describe the bony composition of the nasal cavity, and that means we will be talking about what are the conchae and their associated meatuses on the lateral wall, and we'll talk about which spaces communicate with the nasal cavity. To start off with, I just want to take a moment to point out here that the anterior and posterior aspects of the nasal cavity are open. Anteriorly, we have the piriform aperture, sometimes called the anterior nasal aperture. This is going to be made up of the maxilla inferiorly and laterally, so this portion here, and the nasal bones close it off superiorly. Posteriorly, we have the posterior nasal aperture, also called the choanine, and these have contributions from the palatine bone inferiorly here, the vomer up the middle, and then the sphenoid on the superior and lateral surfaces. All right, so when we're talking about the walls of the nasal cavity then, it's easiest to start off with the medial wall, or the septum, and that is going to separate the right and left cavities. This is pretty straightforward, and it looks the same on both sides. So the anterior portion of that septum is made up of cartilage. This is the bit here. If you pinch your nose and kind of wiggle it side to side, you can feel that that's cartilage because it will move with you. Posteriorly then, we have the bony part of the medial wall here. Superiorly, this is made up of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so this large section superiorly, and then inferiorly, we have a separate bone called the vomer. The lateral wall has a few more pieces to put together. So the most striking features of the lateral nasal wall here are the conchae, or the nasal turbinates that protrude from the wall out into the cavity. The inferior nasal concha is its own bone, but the middle and the superior conchae are parts of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so we see them in orange. The anterior portion of the wall is made up of the maxilla, and the nasal bones contribute to the anterior roof. Posterior to that, we have a little contribution from the lacrimal bone as well. This is a bone that helps to make up part of the eye orbit and now into the nasal cavity. And the superior part of the lateral wall then is made up of the posterior or perpendicular plate of the palatine bone and the medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. Now, those nasal conchae extend the surface area of the nasal wall, and they help create a larger space for mucosa to cover. Having more mucous membrane here helps to warm and to humidify the air as you breathe it in. So if you've ever gone outside on a really cold winter day and sucked in a lungful of cold and dry air, you know how important this is. Our lungs really don't like to breathe cold, dry air. All right, so here is what this looks like with its mucous membrane covering. The other thing that the conchae do is create a protected space, or protected spaces in the nasal cavity that open into neighboring spaces of the head. To get a better look at this, we're going to have to snip these off. So we are going to cut right along these lines here. All right, these spaces that sit laterally or deep to the conchae are referred to either as a recess or a meatus. The sphenoethmoid recess and superior nasal meatus sit deep to the superior conchae. The middle meatus sits deep to the middle nasal concha, and the inferior is deep to the inferior concha. Now, it just so happens that these meatuses light up quite nicely with a number of surrounding empty spaces in the head. These are called sinuses, and they are simply hollow spaces in the cranial bones that are lined with a mucous membrane. These are named for the bones that they sit inside of. We've got frontal sinus in the frontal bone, sphenoid sinus in the sphenoid, maxillary sinus in the maxilla, and the ethmoid has a large number of small sinuses. So the ethmoid I always kind of think of as being balloon that's made out of bone. It's a balloon ball bone. It has a lot of empty cavities in it and very thin pieces of bone that separates those. So instead of having one big sinus, we call these ethmoid air cells. They're the same thing. They're just a lot more of them and they're smaller. All right, and finally, we've got the nasolacrimal duct, which is a hollow passageway that's going to connect from the eye orbit down into the nasal cavity, and it will carry old lacrimal fluid or tears down from the orbit and into the nose for disposal. Now, because these sinuses are so well lined up with nasal meatuses, we find that each space has a specific connection to one or more sinus or duct. These are primarily for drainage of mucus from the sinuses into the nasal cavity. So the sphenoid sinuses sit in the body of the sphenoid. There are technically two of them, even though they're separated just by a very thin plate of bone. So the right side drains into the right nasal cavity and the left drains into the left. And specifically, these are going to drain into the sphenoethmoid recess. The superior nasal meatus has openings for the posterior ethmoid cells. And the middle nasal meatus has openings for the anterior and middle ethmoid air cells. The middle meatus actually has a lot of openings for a lot of sinuses. It has a pathway from the frontal sinus and the maxillary sinus as well. These openings are situated around some features of the ethmoid bone on the lateral wall. So the ethmoid infundibulum, which is this upper end here, it's a gap in the wall, and that extends inferiorly here as a semilunar hiatus. It gets this name because of its shape. It looks like a little half moon. Posterior to that, then, there is a little bulb that protrudes from the wall, and this is called the ethmoid bulla. So infundibulum, semilunar hiatus, and then ethmoid bulla here. All right, the frontal sinus is going to open into that tippy top of the ethmoid infundibulum. The maxillary sinus opens farther down into the semilunar hiatus. And the ethmoid air cells open up into both the ethmoid bulla and down in the semilunar hiatus. And finally, in the inferior meatus, we find the opening to that nasolacrimal duct. So lacrimal fluid draining from the eye and the orbit ends up here, and it helps to keep the nasal cavity moist. That is the end of the material here. So here is your review question. The nasal concha is part of which larger bone? And the correct answer is the ethmoid. The ethmoid contributes quite a lot to the nasal cavity. It has entrances to a number of sinuses, and it contributes to both the lateral and medial walls. That brings us to the end. Thank you very much for joining me.